It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. This week.
Behind the famous and irresistible beam lay a seasoned campaigner of verve and grit.
Sir David was a dedicated parliamentarian, and his loss is felt profoundly across this House.
Politicians pay tribute to Sir David AMESS.
There's few people that I ever met for whom the term right honourable friend was more fitting.
And attention turns to the big tech companies.
While people in public life must remain open to legitimate criticism, they can no longer be vilified or their families subject to the most horrendous abuse, with the connivance of the social media companies for profit.
And the UK government sets out plans to reach net zero.
We will fully embrace this new green industrial revolution, helping the UK to level up as we build back better.
While there is modest short-term investment, there is nothing like the commitment we believe is required.
Hello and welcome to Politics UK. Susan, it's been a sombre week here in Westminster, completely understandable after the tragic death of Sir David AMESS last week.
That's right, and of course MPs had been away for their conference break and they were probably full of all those issues, the big issues of the day like supply chains, cost of living, all that swept aside after the dreadful news that Sir David AMESS had been attacked and killed. And of course, they also had the sad news that James Brokenshire, the former minister, had died as well. So it was a very sad and sombre gathering of MPs. And you've got to remember, the Commons Chamber is actually quite a small and intimate place. And we can all imagine, or try to imagine, what it must be like for a colleague that you've known for many years to be killed in those sort of appalling circumstances. So there was a great deal of sadness, but there was warmth and there was even humour as well, as MPs paid tribute.
I'm sorry the House is returning in such tragic circumstances. Since we last met, we have lost two outstanding friends and colleagues, Sir David AMESS and James Brokenshire. I know honourable and right honourable members from all parts of this House will share my deep sadness at their loss and will want to join me in sending out heartfelt condolences to their families. The circumstances of Sir David's death were despicable and they raised the most fundamental issues about how members of this House are able to perform our vital democratic responsibilities safely and securely.
Behind the famous and irresistible beam lay a seasoned campaigner of verve and grit, whether he was demanding freedom for the people of Iran or courting votes in the Westminster Dog of the Year contest, whether he was battling for Brexit or fighting his way to the front of the parliamentary pancake race. And as every member of this House will know, and as you have just confirmed, Mr. Speaker, he never once witnessed any achievement by any resident of Southend that could not somehow be cited in his bid to secure city status for that distinguished time. As it is only a short time since Sir David last put that very case to me in this chamber, I am happy to announce that Her Majesty has agreed that Southend will be accorded the city status it so clearly deserves.
We are thinking of David and his family. We are thinking, once again, of our dear friend Joe Cox, who was killed just 5 short years ago. And I know that honourable members and their staff will have spent the weekend worrying about their own safety. The emotion is the same across the House. but I remember just how acutely Joe's loss was felt on these benches. So today, on behalf of the entire Labour Party, I want to lean across, to reach across, and to acknowledge the pain that's felt on the opposite benches, and I do.
David's lesson and his legacy is to show kindness and love to all. All of our memories will be of a good man and of a life well lived. May his family and community today know that the true depth of respect, affection and love that he enjoyed across this house. And may his gentle soul now rest in peace. God bless you, David.
I welcome this opportunity to pay tribute to someone who was clearly a well-respected and much-loved colleague to many people in this place. For reasons that I would never wish on any other member of this House, or indeed anyone, I do have a unique perspective on what those closest to David are going through, and I want to send them my love, support and solidarity from myself, my parents, our family and the people of Batley and Spen.
Moving tributes there in the House of Commons. And also in that session on Monday, Susan, MPs were thinking about how the culture of politics and online regulations could be changed in the future.
Yeah, so some of the tributes came from people who were good friends of Sir David AMESS. For example, Mark Francois had made a very powerful tribute, and he also widened the conversation to talk about that increasingly toxic culture towards politics and politicians, especially online. And he called for the forthcoming online safety bill to be strengthened for that reason.
Sir David AMESS was my best and oldest friend in politics. So I confess that I'm hurting terribly. And I hope the House will therefore forgive me if, because of that, my contribution this afternoon is even more incoherent than usual. All of us, wherever we come from, came here to try and help people. We may disagree, sometimes passionately, about how best to help people, but surely we can all agree that we came here to try, for which we are now systematically vilified, day after day. And I simply say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that enough is enough. I suggest that if we want to ensure that our colleague didn't die in vain, we collectively, all of us, pick up the baton, regardless of our party, and take the forthcoming online harms bill and toughen it up markedly. So let's put, if I may be so presumptuous, David's law onto the statute book, the essence of which would be that while people in public life must remain open to legitimate criticism, they can no longer be vilified or their families subject to the most horrendous abuse, especially from people who hide behind a cloak of anonymity, with the connivance of the social media companies for profit.
I think it's a wonderful legacy for David that Southend is now a city. But we can also add to the legacy of David AMESS by ensuring that in all our political debates, in our political discourse, we bring to those debates and that discourse the same respect, decency and compassion that were the symbols of his life. Because David AMESS made a difference. His compassion made a difference to people outside of this house. His kindness made a difference to people inside this house.
We are in this place because we argue with each other about our ideas. The important feature of this is we may disagree with our arguments, but we don't disrespect the motives of those who hold them. And we need to be very careful. This is a lesson to us, that we need to be careful here what we legitimize in what we say about our colleagues. They are not evil people. Nobody in this chamber is an evil individual. They have strong beliefs.
One of the issues, Susan, is about how social media companies should be regulated in the future, and that was a theme that continued at Prime Minister's questions.
Yes. Now, this online safety bill does exist, but it's in draft form at the moment. So Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was pushing hard for the Prime Minister to agree to bring that before MPs, before Christmas, so that they can get on with the work of actually making it a law. And he was also pushing for it to be strengthened, as you were saying, to make it harder on social media bosses whose platforms host some of the hateful content. Keir Starmer was also saying, we heard some of the comment from MPs there about a more cooperative spirit. He was talking about a more cooperative spirit, but of course, democracy is quite confrontational, so judge for yourself how well that went.
If you can believe it, if the House can believe it, as we were paying tribute to Sir David on Monday, Telegram users could access videos of murders and violent threats against politicians, the LGBT community, women and Jews, as we were paying our respects. Tough sanctions are clearly needed. Yet, under the government's current proposals, directors of platforms failing to crack down on extremism would still not face criminal sanctions. Why is that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is this government that brought forward an online harms bill, Mr. Speaker, and he's heard what I've said. He's heard what I've said about the second reading before Christmas, and in the collegiate spirit in which he announced he began his questioning, I can tell him that we will continue to look at ways in which we can toughen up those provisions and to come down hard on those who irresponsibly allow dangerous and extremist content to permeate the internet. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that he's taking this new tough line.
It is frankly beyond belief that, as the Mirror reported yesterday, 40 hours of hateful content from Anjem Chowdhury could be easily accessed online. The Prime Minister and the government could stop this by making it clear that directors of companies are criminally liable for failing to tackle this type of material on their sites. We don't need to delay, so in the collaborative spirit we saw in this House on Monday, will the Prime Minister commit to taking this away, looking at it again, and working with all of us to strengthen his proposed legislation?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've already said that we're willing to look at anything to strengthen the legislation. I've said that we're willing to bring it forward, and we will bring it forward to second reading before Christmas. And yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, we will have criminal sanctions with tough sentences for those who are responsible for allowing this foul content to permeate the internet, Mr. Speaker. The UK has one of the strongest counter-terrorism and counter-extremism systems in the world, as a consequence of which we have foiled 31 terrorist plots since 2017, and nor will we allow them to be released, or those who are convicted to be released early from prison, Mr. Speaker, because that was one of the most important things this government passed and which that party opposed.
Keir Starmer.
Really? After the week we've just had, I really don't want to descend to that kind of knockabout. Mr. Speaker, either we take this seriously, and I'm taking my lead from those on the opposite benches on Monday and what they were saying about the need to tackle this. Either we take it seriously and go forward together, or we do a disservice to those that we pay tributes to.
I'm all in favour of collegiate and cooperative approach, and then in which case I think it would be a fine thing if the opposition would withdraw their opposition to our measures to stop the early release of serious extremist and violent offenders. That's all I'm trying to say. In a collegiate approach, and I'm sure that is what the people of this country will wish to see.
And debate on this important issue will no doubt continue. Susan, thank you for the moment. We'll come back to you later on in the programme. It's time to go to Cardiff and speak to our correspondent there, James Williams. He's at the Welsh Parliament. James, tributes have been paid there as well to Sir David AMESS.
Yes, Joe, a minute's silence was observed here on Tuesday ahead of the session of First Minister's questions. The Llywydd, who is the Senedd's presiding officer, also said the thoughts are with Sir David's family and that politicians should be able to go about their work safely and without fear. She then invited party representatives to pay tribute.
Today, we send a message of sorrow and of sympathy to the friends and family of Sir David AMESS. But in the hurt and the horror, we also send this message. We carry on. Conscious of our own safety and that of our staff, of course, but never willing to let go of our responsibility to the safety of Welsh democracy and those everyday things which keep it healthy and keep it whole, and which our constituents look to us to help sustain.
We must call out hate when we see it and commit to detoxifying our political landscape. The attack on Sir David was an attack on our democracy, and so therewith the greatest tribute that we can all give to Sir David is to continue with our duties and represent our constituents to the best of our abilities. But for now, though, our thoughts are with Sir David's family and all who knew him and loved him. May he rest in peace. Diolch.
Everywhere he went, David brought light. He was the very symbol of what a parliamentarian should be. A man of deep principle, but with the broadest of affection. A strong conviction, but with a kind heart, who died as he lived, listening to the people. There's few people that I ever met for whom the term right honourable friend was more fitting.
One thing I've heard more than anything else over the weekend is that Sir David was always civil when engaging in political debates, even with those with whom he profoundly disagreed. We can all learn to be kind and warm, like Sir David, even when we disagree.
Heartfelt tributes there in the Senedd. James, members have also been looking at a new constitutional commission, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. This was a Labour manifesto commitment for May's Senedd election, mainly because the First Minister and the Welsh Labour government are concerned about the devolution settlement, but also the future of the Union. Now, essentially, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, believes that not only should there be more devolution from Westminster to this place, the Senedd in Cardiff, but also that the fundamental nature of sovereignty in the UK has changed, he argues. It not only rests in Westminster, but in all four parts of the United Kingdom, according to Mark Drakeford, a position, of course, rejected by the Conservatives in Westminster. Now, the Conservatives here in the Senedd, although they believe the Welsh Labour government should be focusing more on the delivery of public services than the Constitution, they have signed up as well to this cross-party commission, which will now look at a range of potential options for Wales's constitutional future, including potentially independence, although it should be stressed that that is not Welsh Labour's preferred option, and that the broad terms of reference for this commission talks about changes to the structures of the United Kingdom, of which Wales is an integral part. That's what the terms of reference says. Now, the Minister for the Constitution gave us some more details on Tuesday afternoon.
The time is right for a serious national conversation in Wales about the options for our future. Clearly, the first broad objective of the Independent Commission will be to consider and develop durable options for fundamental reform of the constitutional structures of the United Kingdom. We want the Independent Commission to initiate a conversation with the people of Wales about what those options might be. Our union is under greater threat today than at any time, and this cannot be ignored. From the current Conservative UK government and its repeated attempts to undermine devolution, to renewed calls for English devolution, to the pressure for a second independence referendum in Scotland, and the ongoing discussions about the constitutional future of Northern Ireland. So the Independent Commission's second broad objective will be to consider and develop all progressive principal options to strengthen Welsh democracy and deliver improvements for the people of Wales.
I do have to say that I was quite surprised to see that independence is one of the things that you have tasked this commission with considering, because we all know, and it's been emphasised by your own First Minister, that independence was very much on the ballot paper at the recent Senedd elections, and because it was front and centre of the Plaid Cymru campaign, and it was overwhelmingly rejected. In fact, the Plaid Cymru share of the vote actually went down. So why on earth the Commission should be tasked with looking at independence and considering independence is beyond me, especially when the Welsh Government is constantly bleating on about not having sufficient resources to be able to do the real work that people want you to get on with, which is to sort out the backlog in our NHS, get to grips with the problems in our economy and deliver the catch-up education that young people across Wales desperately need.
Now, this commission will be co-chaired by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr Rowan Williams, and Professor Laura McAllister from Cardiff University. The idea is that we'll get an interim report towards the end of next year and then the full report towards the end of 2023.
Now, James, we've talked about it before on this programme, but the debate about whether Wales should have its own inquiry into COVID-19 continues.
Yes, it does. Now, essentially, the opposition parties here in the Senedd, the Conservatives, Plaid Cymru and the Liberal Democrats, say that there should be a Wales-specific COVID-19 inquiry. No, says the First Minister and the Welsh Labour government. You'll get the best answers if we scrutinise what Welsh ministers did as part of a UK-wide inquiry. Although he has said that, look, if there's not enough focus on Wales in that UK-wide inquiry, he could reconsider. Now, the First Minister told Senedd members on Tuesday that he'd spoken to the Prime Minister on Monday and that Boris Johnson had given him assurances that there would be proper focus, proper scrutiny on Welsh ministers' decisions in that UK-wide inquiry. So does that mean that this issue is now done and dusted? Not quite. The First Minister left the door on a Wales-specific inquiry slightly ajar, saying that he'd keep an eye on what the UK government does with its own inquiry now over the coming months to ensure that there's proper consultation with the devolved governments.
James, thanks for bringing us the latest on that. That's James Williams in Cardiff. Susan, the government at Westminster have published their plan for how UK will reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050.
Yep, just a few days away, really, from the UK's big moment on the world stage, hosting that COP26 conference. So they were setting out their own stall for what the UK is going to do to try and lower emissions. So the headline bits of it, I suppose, were encouragement for people to get heat pumps instead of gas-guzzling boilers that we have in our homes now, encouragement to move to electric cars, talk about tree planting to soak up carbon, also to soak up carbon, plants for carbon capture and storage, two of those in the north of England and Wales. That last one made the SNP jolly angry because they'd hoped that a plant in Aberdeenshire would be picked, but it wasn't, and they said that was for political reasons. Now, the bigger overall questions and criticisms of this plan really were, one, that this is going to be jolly expensive for us individually because those heat pumps, even with grants, don't come cheap. And also whether it even then does enough to get us to where we need to be by the middle of the century to stop the more catastrophic aspects of climate change.
We will fully embrace this new green industrial revolution, helping the UK to level up as we build back better and get to the front of the global race to go green. We need to capitalise on this to ensure British industries and workers benefit. I can therefore announce that the strategy will support up to 440,000 jobs across sectors and across all parts of the UK in 2030. There'll be, Mr. Speaker, more specialists in low-carbon fuels in Northern Ireland and low-carbon hydrogen in Sheffield, electric vehicle battery production in the northeast of England, engineers in Wales, green finance in London and offshore wind technicians in Scotland.
The plan falls short on delivery. And while there is modest short-term investment, there is nothing like the commitment we believe is required. And we know why. When asked at the weekend about the Treasury's approach to these issues, a Bayes source said this: "They are not climate change deniers, but they are emphasising the short-term risks rather than long-term needs." Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's fingerprints are all over these documents, and not in a good way. So we've waited months for the heat and building strategy. It is a massive letdown. We're in the midst of an energy price crisis caused by a decade of inaction. Emissions from buildings are higher than in 2015. The biggest single programme that could make a difference is a 10-year, house-by-house, street-by-street retrofit plan to cut bills, emissions and ensure energy security.
He talks about levelling up, but his levelling up does not include Scotland. We've got the highest electricity grid charges in Europe, which puts renewable energy in Scotland at risk, and 20% more expensive South East England, which actually also affects the UK's net zero trajectory. Scottish energy consumers are now getting made to pay for their nuclear that we don't want. And as I've said, Peterhead's now been sacrificed for the Red Wall constituencies. Mr. Speaker, the reality is when it comes to Scotland, this UK government isn't helping us tackle climate change. It's a scorched earth policy instead as we head towards independence.
Electricity for heating our homes only makes sense if the electricity used is not derived from fossil fuels. And yes, because of Lib Dems in government, the renewable sector has made big strides, but it is actually by no means accelerating in the way it should be. So will the government take this opportunity before COP26 to announce an end date for using fossil fuels in the production of electricity?
I have many constituents, all members will have many constituents, who are struggling to pay the gas bill at the moment, let alone face the prospect of paying between £6,000 and £15,000 for a new heat pump, notwithstanding the grants that he's announced today, or the hope which we all share that the cost of heat pumps will fall. What is the government's plan for ensuring that all of the households in our communities are able to make the transition to a zero-carbon future that we know must happen?
And, of course, Susan, that climate summit that you mentioned is coming up, and we'll have a lot more news around it then. There's been some renewed debate about what's happening with the spread of coronavirus and how ministers should respond. Tell us about that.
Well, this is surely the issue that the government had hoped had gone away and they could get on with all the other things that they want to do, and COVID has stopped them. However, it's autumn and the cases are rising again, so the government's critics say it really is time now to move to what they're calling the government's Plan B. That's things like going back to mandatory wearing of face masks, maybe COVID passports to get into places, that kind of thing. Things that are already in place in Scotland and Wales. However, the government's resisting it at this stage.
We have ambulances backed up outside hospitals, patients waiting hours upon hours in A&E, cancer operations cancelled and NHS staff exhausted. Has there ever been, in the history of the NHS, a more complacent attitude from a Secretary of State as we head into winter? And on flu, only 36% of over 65s have been vaccinated. But with infections running so high, ministers need to, if I may, stop vacillating and get vaccinating. The wall of defence is crumbling. We know with this virus you have to get ahead of it, otherwise it gets ahead of you. How will the minister fix this stalling vaccination programme?
Our vaccines have created a wall of defence. It's incredible how many people have taken up the offer, not for the first jab but the second jab, and now are coming forward for their boosters. In fact, at the start of the week, 5.4 million people were eligible for their booster jab, and 4 million people had taken up that opportunity. 4 million arms have been jabbed up to now. And with regards to the flu vaccine programme, once again, it's an extremely important programme, and people are being called forward for their flu jab, which is helping to protect us throughout the winter months. And my message is, if you get your call for your flu jab, don't wait to get your call for your booster jab and vice versa. Get whichever jab you get invited for first.
Thank you, Susan. We'll come back to you again later in the programme. It's time to go to Belfast now and speak to Jim Fitzpatrick in Stormont. Jim, politicians where you are have also been reflecting on the death of Sir David AMESS.
Yes, Joe. Many warm tributes from MLAs here who didn't know Sir David personally. But unfortunately here in Northern Ireland, probably because of our troubled history, we have experience of attacks on politicians and indeed murder in the past. Just a few feet away from where I'm standing is the Senate chamber. Now that was a functioning upper house during the days of the old Stormont Parliament. Today it is simply a committee room, but just outside the room there is a plaque that commemorates the murder of Senator Paddy Wilson, who was killed along with his friend Irene Andrews in a frenzied attack in 1973. It was a loyalist Protestant paramilitary attack on a nationalist Catholic politician and his Protestant friend. We also had an MP for South Belfast, the Reverend Robert Bradford, murdered in 1981 by the IRA at his constituency office. And so politicians are aware of these things. Many of them over the years have carried personal protection weapons, and some of them even, during the Troubles, had round-the-clock police security. But I think what people were reflecting on here at Stormont this week was just the risks that still public representatives face in their work.
I just rise to add my voice of sympathy for the family and friends of Sir David AMESS MP. It is truly appalling in a democratic society that those who have been elected by the people to represent and serve them should be so brutally attacked and murdered while doing so. The tributes to Sir David over the past few days have been so powerful, and by all accounts he was incredibly diligent while maintaining a healthy work-life balance. And we all saw the beautiful photos of his family, who I have no doubt provided him with stability and unwavering support in what we all know is a 24/7 rule.
We've had multiple attacks on public representatives over the years, and members of this House from all sides continue to receive threats, and that's to be condemned. We do need to think about how we treat each other, how we speak to each other, and that goes beyond just this Assembly chamber. It goes to wider society. Too often I hear public representatives being dehumanised by people, dehumanised by the media. We are very much part of this society.
I've had to physically remove an uninvited person from my home. That's the type of thing that we experience as public representatives, and that is not acceptable for anyone to have to deal with that. Just before I came into the chamber, I spoke to one of our MPs who also this morning had to call the police to remove people from his office, people who have come to protest in their office, but they intimidated the staff to the point where the staff were frightened where the PSNI had to be called to the office. That's not acceptable.
I believe that we have quite a volatile concoction right now in our society. We have increased levels of vulnerability when it comes to mental health. We have increased numbers of people who are susceptible and at risk of radicalisation. And then we also have a deep anger that has emerged as a result of this pandemic.
And that last comment there was from Nicola Mallon, who's a minister in the executive here. And we also learnt this week that there had been specific threats against her and members of her staff that have been passed to the police. I suppose the one difference now is we're a long way from those dark days I talked about a few moments ago. But the kind of threats that politicians now face are maybe such as politicians elsewhere in the UK face, which seem to emanate from the kind of nastiness that seems to grow online and in conspiracy theories on social media.
Jim, let's talk about members who've also been looking at how prosecutors handled a case that goes back to the Troubles.
Yes, this is the case of Dennis Hutchings, an ex-soldier who died during his case. He was 80 years old and he had underlying health conditions. He was being prosecuted and charged with attempted murder for a case involving the shooting dead of a young man who was 27 at the time, who was running away from an army patrol near his hometown in County Tyrone back in 1974. Although he was 27, he had the mental age of a child. Mr. Hutchings had criticised the prosecution. He had said that it was unfair to bring soldiers into court so far removed from the actual events, and there are other cases where others have campaigned against cases like this. However, the Public Prosecution Service defended the action. It said that new evidence had come to light in 2015 because the nature of the charge was so severe, it was appropriate to proceed, and indeed a High Court judge had ruled that there was enough evidence to proceed. Nationalist politicians argued that this was perhaps a belated attempt to try and get some justice. But for unionists, this was seen perhaps as a witch hunt, perhaps as something that affects veterans more than paramilitaries. And one of those criticising the PPS was Jim Allister, who himself is a QC.
So I do say to Mr. Heron, our Director of Public Prosecutions, why did you do this to this man? What was the justification and the basis for dragging him before the courts?
And indeed, I'm mindful of the families, both of John Pat Cunningham, a young man who was shot in the back, and the family of Dennis Hutchings. Is never easy to lose anyone, regardless of what age they are. But I dispute the fact that this was not in the public interest. And indeed, I'm not aware of the level of evidence, but it clearly met the very high threshold set for prosecution by the PPS, and that's why it went to trial. And I think all members here have expressed the view that no one should be above the law, that the law should be applied equally. And that is a maxim I think we can all have faith in and belief in.
What we did do is we took a guy in his 80s with kidney failure, with heart disease,
and we brought him to court. And some will say, well, that's in the public interest. And some will say, well, in hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Well, it's not hindsight, because the case was made. The case was made that this would have a detrimental effect on his health, and as we saw, it did.
Now, Mr Hutchings died, unfortunately, with COVID. He had those underlying health conditions, and he had been offered the opportunity to attend trial via video link, which he refused that offer. Now, this, of course, then effectively brings this case to an end, but not the issue. The government wants to stop these historical prosecutions, and so it wants to bring in legislation to have a statute of limitations, effectively a time limit, to ensure that they don't come forward anymore. That would stop soldiers ending up in the dock. However, it would also stop former paramilitaries facing justice too, and for that reason, it doesn't enjoy cross-community support here and has, in fact, attracted some international condemnation.
Well, that's an emotive debate, and it will no doubt continue, Jim. On a completely different subject, the government's been setting out its plans for tackling coronavirus this winter.
Yes, the executive here, of course, multi-party executive, they're all brought together, don't always agree, but what they have agreed to do is maintain the current restrictions, which are a little bit tighter than perhaps apply in England, and that will mean mandatory face coverings in certain indoor settings. It will mean encouraging flexible working and home working where that's possible, and it also means the executive retaining the potential to introduce vaccine passports, but they haven't done that yet. The First Minister essentially said what he wanted to see over the next couple of months was people exercising their own personal responsibility.
We are very mindful that the COVID pandemic has been with us for 19 months, and we appreciate that it has been incredibly difficult for everyone. The vast majority of people continue to do the right things, and we are thankful. There are some basics that we need citizens to continue to do, and we want to explain why we are asking this of you. We understand that the vaccine programme has given us all hope. We ask you to remember that each act of personal adherence to the public health advice, however small, makes a big difference.
Well, I think that the issue to look at, perhaps, is that of vaccine passports. It's been a contentious one that hasn't found agreement at the executive table, but it may come back on the agenda if Northern Ireland's case rate, which is relatively high, continues to rise. They are in existence south of the border in the Irish Republic, where you need a vaccine passport to go to a pub or restaurant. Those proponents of it say it helps bring down the cases. It may be an issue that we'll return to in the weeks and months ahead.
Jim Fitzpatrick there at Stormont. Thank you very much. We can't go to Scotland because Holyrood is still in recess, but it's back next week and we will bring you all the key moments from there then. Susan, MPs here have also been paying their respects to another colleague, you mentioned it at the beginning of the programme, who also sadly passed away.
Yes, James Brokenshire, the former Northern Ireland Secretary who died earlier this month from cancer at the age of 53. He had been ill for some time. He had already come back once from his illness to become a minister, but he stepped down in the summer saying that he wasn't getting better as he'd hoped, and his family were in the public gallery to hear some of the tributes from MPs.
I worked closely with James for the first time when I was Mayor of London, and he was the honourable member for Hornchurch, and then for Old Bexley and Sidcup. And I saw how much he cared for the interests of his constituents, always taking the time to stop and talk to people and listen to what they had to say. Unflappable, earnest, sincere.
When, as a new MP in 2015, I was appointed as Shadow Immigration Minister, I shadowed James Brokenshire. In one of my first outings in the Bill Committee, I almost missed my cue to make my argument. Now, some of you would see that as a blessing. But James was far too decent for that. He wouldn't take advantage. He went out of his way to ensure not only that I was heard, but that I was heard with respect.
James was a remarkable man. He was an outstanding minister, a great constituency member of Parliament, and a true friend. Words have been used by others, such as diligent, hard-working, and he was both of those. As a minister, he was assiduous in dealing with the briefs that he read. He was thoughtful in his consideration of the issues and careful in his decision-making. That is what you want from a government minister. He gave his time and effort because he understood the importance of the decisions he was making. He cared about people.
My right honourable friend from Maidenhead has summed up exactly. He was diligent, he was careful in his decision making, and he was thoughtful. But he always remembered there were people involved in the decisions he was taking. It was never taken in the abstract. He always thought about the people who'd be directly affected.
So more tributes there for another MP who has died. No wonder it has been a sad and sombre week, as we were reflecting at the beginning of the programme. Next week, Susan, big set piece, part of the political calendar, which is when Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, will have his big moment with his red box and present the budget and a spending review.
That's right, all wrapped up. Sometimes these two things have been separated out, but this is it all together. And there will be plenty to say, I would imagine. It is back to quite hard politics because, of course, we've had months of a very difficult financial and economic situation with COVID and lots of pressure on Rishi Sunak over these months to do more about the cost of living, which seems to be zooming up, and about welfare because of that removal of the £20 a week universal credit uplift that he had brought in during the pandemic. There's been a lot of pressure on him from his own side as well to do something else to help people in those low-income households. So people will be looking at it very, very closely to see what he's got in that red box.
And also it comes against a backdrop of reported tensions between number 10 and number 11. These are things that we are used to, of course, in politics. Disputes or disagreements over policy and the direction government should go in between a Chancellor and a Prime Minister. Denied, of course, as always, in public. But that always adds a certain amount of drama because Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has been accused, often by unnamed sources, of being keen to splurge the cash, particularly for newly won seats and voters in former Labour heartlands. And Rishi Sunak, unsurprisingly, holding on to the purse strings in the Treasury, wanting to be slightly more cautious when it comes to spending more.
When has there not been that tension between number 10 and number 11 Downing Street? Those of our viewers who may have been watching the documentaries about the tensions between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair will remember that. Gordon Brown suggesting that Tony Blair had stolen his budget once by making an announcement before he'd come out with his budget. I think those tensions always go on. One is the political boss and really the economic boss, but that Chancellor is always pushing for his, and always, I suspect, got his eye on that main job as well. So those political tensions are always there, and I don't think this relationship is probably any different.
Some announcements, of course, have already been made. I mean, you mentioned the end to the temporary increase, the £20 a week in universal credit, which has caused some consternation, not just from the opposition parties, but also on the Conservative backbenches, and also a rise in national insurance that we know is going to happen next year in April in order to pay and raise money for the NHS in the post-pandemic recovery and for social care. So to some extent, we do know some of the big spending decisions that are going to be coming down the line.
Yes, in a way, he's preempted his own budget. There was once a time when you had a budget purger, when nobody talked about what was going to be in the budget beforehand. Yeah. But now we've actually got announcements, and indeed it put into law, that some of these things, for example, the national insurance is going to happen. So it'd be interesting to see what else he has in his locker in order to surprise us.
Thank you, Susan. And of course, we'll be covering that budget statement live next week. But that's all for today. I'll be back on Monday with Politics Live at 12:15. Please join me then. Bye-bye.